So I had this idea. It may be unrealistic, complicated, or maybe even a little abstract, but hear me out. I saw a beautiful, very distinct dalmatian in a shelter, and it got me wondering, what if shelters could DNA test purebred dogs and identify the breeder who originally produced them? Not to transfer ownership or create legal responsibility, simply so they know. Because many responsible breeders say, if you can't keep this dog, bring it back to me. But what happens when that connection gets lost? The more I thought about it, the more I realized this idea touches on genetics, ethics, contracts, rescue, shelter populations, and breeder accountability all at once. Could it work technically? For many purebred dogs, yes. If a breeder DNA tests their breeding dogs, which many already do, and puppies are DNA profiled before leaving, and then a shelter dog is DNA tested, parentage could potentially be established with a high degree of certainty. This kind of thing is already done in livestock, horses, and some dog breeding programs. And in Dalmatian specifically, many breeders are already submitting DNA samples for health testing, like LUA status, parentage verification, and similar records. So in my mind, the technology isn't really the obstacle, the infrastructure is. Because the real question isn't, can DNA identify where a dog came from? The bigger question is, what would we do with that information once we had it? And before anyone says only responsible breeders DNA test, that's just not necessarily true anymore. Many backyard breeders, doodle breeders, commercial breeders, and hobby breeders are already using services like Embark, Wisdom Panel, and other canine DNA companies. Sometimes it's for health testing, genetics, marketing, or simply to advertise that their dogs are DNA tested. The motivation doesn't really matter. What matters is that in many cases, the DNA information already exists, which raises another question. Instead of creating an entirely new national database from scratch, could there someday be a voluntary partnership between shelters and existing canine DNA companies? Could a shelter submit a DNA sample, identify a potential match, and simply notify the breeder that a dog came from their breeding program and may have entered the shelter system? Not ownership, not liability, not legal responsibility. Just a chance to reconnect a lost link in the chain. And I think the strongest purpose would be this: creating one last safety net between a dog and a shelter kennel. Because many ethical breeders genuinely mean it when they say that if at any point you cannot keep this dog, it must come back to me. A lot of breeder contracts already say exactly that, but in real life things get, messy. Contracts get lost, people move, dogs change hands, shelters often have no idea who bred the dog, and the connection is lost. DNA could potentially restore that connection. Not because the breeder owns the dog, not because the breeder is automatically legally responsible, but because someone who once cared enough to produce that dog may want the opportunity to help. And to me, that's a pretty simple and humane objective. The first possible benefit would be reuniting dogs with responsible breeders. Many ethical breeders genuinely want to know if one of their dogs end up in a shelter. They don't want their dogs sitting there unknown, unclaimed, or misunderstood. A DNA system could potentially identify the breeder, the parents, or even possible littermates, and allow the shelter to notify the breeder before the dog sits in the shelter system for weeks or months. And I think that could make a difference, because if a breeder is willing to reclaim the dog may be able to skip a prolonged shelter stay, avoid multiple transfers, and return to someone who understands the breed, understands the lines, understands the temperament, and may already have appropriate placement options available. And yes, breed-specific rescues already do incredible work helping these dogs, but many breed rescues operate with limited foster homes, limited funding, and a constant influx of dogs needing placement. So the goal would never be to replace breed rescue. The goal would be to create another possible path before a dog ever reaches that point. And if a breeder is willing and able to step in, that's one less dog competing for limited resources. For breed-specific dogs, especially breeds that are often misunderstood or have specialized needs, creating additional opportunities for intervention could be a meaningful welfare improvement. But still, there's also the accountability side, and this is where the idea gets a little more interesting. Imagine if a shelter or breed organization discovered that one breeder had produced one surrendered dog in 15 years, while another breeder had produced 27 surrendered dogs in 5 years. That's pretty useful information. It could reveal patterns in placement practices, buyer screening, breeder support, and overall program outcomes. Right now, a lot of that information is invisible. Breeders are often judged by titles, health testing, show results, pedigrees, and sometimes social media presence. But maybe one of the most important questions should also be, how many of your dogs end up in shelters, and how often do you take them back? That would be a completely different accountability metric if it was verifiable. And honestly, maybe even a more meaningful one. So there's also the data side. We really don't know enough about what happens to dogs after they leave breeders. A system like this could track surrender rates, age of surrender, common reasons for surrender, long-term outcomes, and trends within specific breeds or breeding programs. That kind of data could help improve breeding practices, placement practices, buyer education, and breed-specific support. Obviously, there are major problems with this idea too. The first one, I think, is cost. Who pays for this? DNA testing every shelter dog would be expensive. Even if testing costs drop significantly, millions of dogs enter shelters every year. So I don't think the realistic version is to DNA test every shelter dog. The more realistic version would probably be DNA testing certain purebred looking dogs entering shelters, especially in cases where identifying the breeder might create a path out of the shelter system. Another issue is that many dogs wouldn't match. A large portion of shelter dogs are mixed breeds, backyard bred, unregistered, from accidental litters, or from breeders who never DNA profiled their dogs in the first place. So for many dogs, the result would simply be no match found. That means this system would work best for intentionally bred, purebred dogs whose breeders participate in DNA databases. And that creates one of the biggest weaknesses of the entire idea. The breeders most likely to participate are probably the breeders already trying to do things responsibly. They health test, keep records, microchip, DNA profile, they use contracts, and they want their dogs back. Meanwhile, the breeders producing the highest number of dogs that end up in shelters may be the least likely to participate. So this wouldn't solve the broader shelter crisis or address many of the root causes that contribute to it, but it could reduce the number of well-bred, identifiable, purebred dogs sitting in shelters when their breeder would have taken them back. And I genuinely think that that's still worth talking about. And then there is the legal side. Suppose a Dalmatian enters a shelter and DNA identifies the breeder and the parents. Does that mean the breeder owns the dog? Generally, no. The breeder produced the dog, but that doesn't automatically mean they still have legal ownership. The dog may have been sold, transferred, surrendered, or rehomed legally by the owner. So DNA wouldn't be a magic legal claim. It would be information, and I think that distinction matters. The system would have to be built around notification, not ownership. Something like a dog genetically identified as originating from your breeding program has entered XYZ shelter. Would you like to be contacted? No ownership claim, no forced return, just notification. And that alone could potentially save some dogs. Another uncomfortable reality is that not every breeder would be an appropriate placement option. DNA can tell you where a dog came from, but it can't tell you whether that breeder is responsible, ethical, or capable of helping. So there would need to be specific safeguards. Maybe the breeder is notified, but the shelter still determines whether placement is appropriate. Maybe breed clubs or rescue organizations are also involved. But it couldn't simply be DNA says this is your dog, come get it. I think that would be too simplistic. There's also privacy concerns. Some owners may not like the idea of a breeder being notified if their dog enters the shelter, so there would need to be clear rules around consent, data access, and what information is shared. And then there's the bigger philosophical question underneath all of this. Does a breeder's responsibility end at the sale? Many responsible breeders would say no. They'd say every dog I produce is my responsibility for life. And if that's true, then maybe there should be a way to reconnect breeders to the dogs they produced when the chain of communication breaks down with humans, because that's really what this idea is about. This isn't about punishment, ownership rights, or pretending DNA would solve the shelter crisis. It's about restoring a lost connection. If a dog enters a shelter and the person who brought that dog into the world is willing and able to help, shouldn't they at least have the opportunity to know? That's why I don't think this idea is ridiculous necessarily, because it's asking a different question. Can genetics be used as a reunification tool? Can DNA create one more safety net for dogs? The practical impact might be limited. It would require funding, privacy protections, legal clarity, and cooperation from shelters, breeders, and DNA companies. But it's still a meaningful question about lifetime responsibility. Because if you truly stand behind every puppy you produce for life, then knowing one of your dogs needs help isn't a burden. It's the whole point. And I think there's validity to the idea that responsible breeding isn't just the care, planning, and placement that happens before a puppy goes home. Maybe it's whether that dog still has someone willing to help if life doesn't go according to plan. And if we had a way to find someone who might help, why wouldn't we at least try? If you made it to the end, I genuinely appreciate your time. Maybe this idea never goes anywhere, but if conversations like this help us find better ways to support dogs in the future, then I think that they're worth having.